Hey, how's it going, guys? I wanted to get into another little quick Weather 101 session here. And one of the things that people ask about a lot, not necessarily ask me about a lot, but just ask about a lot in general on hunting forums and whatever else, is thermals. And basically, thermals are just little plumes of rising air that are caused by heating from the sun. And one of the ways you can actually visualize these things is by a process called Rayleigh-Benard convection. And it's a it's a process that is studied in fluid dynamics and meteorology and um, all the other good stuff that deals with this sort of science. But it's essentially what thermals are, is Rayleigh-Benard convection. And I just wanted to point you guys to a couple little YouTube videos where you could look at this yourself and get an idea of what these actually look like physically. You know, you can't see them obviously in the real world, but this gives you a visual of how they behave, and maybe is going to help you get an idea of how to better handle them in your hunting situations. And so what this model is doing is it's starting with a uniform um, sort of pocket, little cube of air here, which is very similar to conditions in the very early morning. When there's no sun to heat the ground or anything like that, the air is pretty much uniform in most cases at the very lowest levels, like where we hunt. And so what this model is doing is starting with this uniform air and then just heating the surface down here. And eventually you start to get these little pockets of air, little plumes that rise up and sort of mushroom out at the top. And I'll show you what that looks like here. So as it heats up, here come these little plumes. And these are thermals. This is what they look like. Now, one thing about this is that this little model here has a lid on it. And so for that reason, the plumes hit the top and they kind of smash and start to do things that aren't necessarily natural. Um, like, for example, in the real world, this isn't going to come up and hit a lid and then just start tumbling like this. Now, there are scenarios where you could have this happen. So again, you know, I talk about being on the side of a hill a lot, because it's sort of the easiest example to give of how things behave. But say you are on the side of a hill, as these thermals rise up and they say there's a light wind kind of pushing them to the side, they're going to hit the side of that hill and then they will tumble over like that. And you know, people talk about this a lot, like deer walk along the sides of hills because they can use the thermals from below and the wind tumbling over from above. And this is why they come up and these thermals kind of do a little, they rise up, they catch your scent, then they kind of swirl over once they, you know, sort of break up a little bit at the top. And this is just a good thing to look at when you're considering how to deal with these things. And there's tons of videos on this. If you just search Rayleigh-Benard convection, that's how you spell it right there. And even if you forget how to spell it, you can probably get pretty close and it'll turn up some videos. And here's another one here. This is a lot poorer resolution version, but this has a little bit bigger box, so gives you a little more time to watch it behave naturally. So as the sun heats one pocket on the surface, it's going to cause this little plume of rising air because it's hotter than the air around it. And it's going to go up and kind of do its thing like this. Even if you don't have a box, you notice how these things kind of start to curl over like this as they go up. And what you run into a lot of times is you'll have uneven heating on, you know, the sides of hills or down in gullies or whatever, and you'll still, you know, you'll have some you'll there's a video, The Hunting Public, with Aaron Warbritton and those guys. If you haven't watched The Hunting Public, you need to check them out. They're a great hunting team that puts awesome videos out, and they're mostly public land hunters, but there is private land hunting on there too. But they toss out milkweed in pretty much every video and watch what it does and see how the air behaves. And there's a video, I think it's called Giant Buck at 30 Yards or something like that, where the deer comes out, starts to walk down into this gully, and even though their milkweed was blowing away from the direction that that deer was walking, it eventually got pulled down into that gully. And the reason for that is because A, the tumbling effect that these thermals have, like this, because the sun was shining. You know, if you can pretend there's a little hill right here where I'm kind of moving my mouse, the sun was shining on the surface of this hill and the gully was right here. And so as the heating from the thermals rises up and they kind of do this tumbling motion, that scent was getting pulled by those thermals and kind of carried down into that gully. And so for that reason, you know, the buck was like 5 feet from being in Aaron's shooting lane, but caught their scent from these thermals pulling the wind down into that little gully. So they got busted. And these are things you got to think about in the early mornings. Now, when you get later in the day, if it's really sunny, eventually it starts to become really uniform and mixed, and you don't have this anymore. If you let this go out further in time, everything starts to become pretty uniform and mixed, and it's just not as much of an issue. This is mostly something that's very prevalent in the early mornings. But now in the evening, you can have the opposite effect. And the way that happens, good Lord. Now these two-dimensional Rayleigh-Bernard convection videos are a mess, but I just want to show this so I can kind of illustrate this. You get the opposite effect in the evenings by the cool air. Basically, as the sun sets, you have sort of the inverse effect going on. The air above the ground is cooling before the air at the surface does, and so it starts to sink down. And this is what that looks like. It just starts to sink down from above. And so if you're hunting on a hill in the evening time, the thermals are going to be pulling your scent down instead of up. And this is the heating from the surface thing. So you have like nighttime thermals here, morning time thermals here. And this gets really ridiculously convoluted after a few minutes. So I wouldn't watch it past like, maybe the 45-second mark, because you can just look at that. Yeah. And this isn't like something that happens in the real world very often in most situations. But yeah. Let me see if I can, I'll point you to that video if you haven't watched it already. If you heard of Midwest Whitetail, these guys used to be with Midwest Whitetail, but they branched off and started doing their own thing. Let's see. Well, good Lord, where is it? Here it is. Skipped right over it. Okay, so it's Public Land Day 31, Giant Buck at 30 Yards. That's the name of the video on The Hunting Public. And this whole last few minutes of this thing right here, he just sits and talks.
Little ditch all
His
season
whole life,
long.
probably.
Yeah, I mean his whole life basically.
He just talks about this massive buck that's living back in this piece of public land, and just talks about how he knows how the wind works back in there, and he shows him throwing some milkweed out and watching how it gets pulled down in that gully, and they weren't really paying attention to that prior to the hunt, and it ended up the deer busted him for that reason. So that's just something I just wanted to kind of give you guys this video and point you towards some resources on YouTube where you could kind of study up on this stuff yourself, and maybe help you the next time you go out and thermals are going to be an issue for you. So, and this will be on Hunt the Front under the videos tab very shortly as soon as this gets up. So if you ever need to come back to this, that's where it'll be.